if a child is in burnout, it is very difficult for the parents not to go down with them. No matter how robust you are as a human, as a parent, we have professional jobs, we have, I would say we're quite well functioning adults. To watch your child break at, 7 years old, 8 years old, or a teenager, whatever age, is the most distressing thing for you to helplessly watch and want to do the right thing. That's the impact, is that then you're in recovery for a really long time whilst trying to access support. And actually the supports that you're then trying are reactive. They're not proactive.
What happens when the system doesn't understand your child? Because for lots of families, that's the reality. They're not dealing with just behaviour, they're dealing with being misunderstood and sometimes judged when a child doesn't meet expected milestones. And when that happens, things escalate. I'm Richard Poore, an award-winning family lawyer and the only lawyer in the UK with an MBE for legal services to domestic abuse victims. Welcome to Let's Talk About Family Law. I'm muting the conversation one story at a time. Today I'm joined by Joanne Parry and Louise Legge from Family Avenues, experienced practitioners working directly with families, particularly those raising neurodivergent children, and helping them understand their child and navigate the challenges in a way that actually works for them. So, let's talk about it.
Let's talk. I've got something for you and you've got something for me. A simple little back and forth, nothing to it, you see. Life could be a beach with a cool breeze by the sea if we just set ourselves free. So let's talk.
So, for anyone listening, when we say family support, what does that actually look like for the people that you help?
It's, family support is such a wide topic, isn't it? And it always depends what service a family are approaching. But for Family Avenues, it is looking at their specific circumstances. It is offering our insight and advice from a neurodivergent perspective, and working with them to kind of look at what path they need to take, which direction they need to use, because it can be really confusing. And there's so much information out there that's contradictory. There's so much information out there that's wrong, that you can end up going down the wrong path. We talk quite often about how parents miss opportunities for getting their children diagnosed or getting the right support in place because of misconceptions about what autism or ADHD look like.
Do you find that there is, like you've said, about the misconceptions and the wrong information being provided to families? Is there a lot of that going around then, that a lot of people are going to different people and they're being given information that's totally wrong or not right for their children at all?
I think there's quite a mismatch between often what a child needs and what is expected by systems. And, especially when we kind of look at things like attendance, if a child is struggling to attend school and a parent has never experienced anything like that before, the professionals in their lives are very likely telling them, well, they have to go to school. That's not an option. And then they'll be told things like, well, just get them through the door in their pajamas and we'll do the rest, or they're absolutely fine once they're here. And I think that then causes such a conflict in parents because they feel as though they have to do what those professionals are telling them to do, but actually the advice isn't neuroaffirming and it's going to be really detrimental to the child because they're not then having their needs met. If you force a child to do something that, their whole nervous system is telling them is unsafe, and then expect them to be able to thrive and learn, then absolutely the parents are being given, the wrong advice, but they trust it because of the source. And that's where I think learning for professionals still has a very long way to go.
I think from the social aspect and from society, saying there's not many people out there who are doing what you're doing, talking about children with neurodiversity, and they are relying on the local authority to kind of give them that information or that assistance. But again, there's not that much training on it. And the ones that do have the training don't have that opportunity to kind of say, look, this isn't right. This isn't the reality of what's happening. What is the reality of raising a neurodiverse child?
I mean, it's different for everybody. It really is. I think the things that, as a parent of neurodivergent children, and I have three, and they're all completely different, as with all children. Um, it's the holding everything, the emotional load of the worry about all the things that they're struggling with. It's then all the phone calls and emails, the back and forth that you have with lots of professionals. We've had a lot of involvement with CAMS. I talk to families that have had involvement with CAMS, and their neurodivergence almost can be a barrier to getting support, because there is that, well, it's not, yes, they've got some anxiety, yes, they've got some depression, but actually that's linked to their autism. So therefore, that's not our expertise. That's not, we are dealing with children who are having an acute mental health crisis. Now, that child can be having an acute mental health crisis. They still need support. There isn't a specialist mental health service for neurodivergent children. So then they fall in this gap, and parents hold that worry. So you're holding that worry. You're trying to keep your child safe. You're not sleeping. You might be. I mean, most parents that I've come across in the SEN sector either are doing significantly reduced hours of work, or they're not working because they cannot work and manage all their child's needs and be present for their child, who may be on reduced timetable, may not be attending school at all. And there's just layers and layers of worry and layers of battle. And there's also things that parents find really difficult to talk about. It's really hard to admit that your child is being violent towards you at home, because they're reaching such a level of, they're masking heavily when they're out at school, when they're with other family members. And then when they come home, they explode. It's like a shaken up Coke bottle. Like every time that they are holding something in, that Coke bottle's getting a shake. So then when they get home, they don't know how to decompress those feelings and they explode.
Yeah.
And that's really dangerous, because you've got parents who don't know where to go for support. They can't talk to the other school parents because of that layer of shame and guilt.
So like you're going to be judged.
Yeah, you don't necessarily feel like you can speak to school about it. And when parents do speak to school about it, they quite often get the response of, well, they're fine here. We don't see any of that.
But this is the thing. We're talking about neurodiversity if it's a rare kind of thing, and that it only happens for a few children. But children with neurodiversity, it's more and more common. And it's the stigma, like you've said, that parents don't talk about it, or they can't reach out because they fall into the gap where they don't think it's severe enough to be able to assist. But it's such a common issue that parents are facing, that children are facing, that we're just forgetting about. Would you agree?
Yeah, and I think it's one of those things where, people say, there never used to be so many stars in the sky until we developed telescopes. And it's, I think actually neurodivergent children have always been there, and they grow into neurodivergent adults. And I think as families, people have just been missed for so many generations, that now we're starting to see the scope and level of neurodivergence. And I don't think it is that there's, more neurodivergent people or more neurodivergent children, but there is definitely a lot more awareness, particularly in girls who do present differently to boys. And that is a massive barrier to, kind of getting the right support in place and getting early support in place. And I think education for professionals hasn't caught up yet. That's the crux of it, really.
Louise, what happens though when the system and society doesn't understand these children? What are the consequences for the future, for parents, for children alike? What would you say the consequences will be?
I think for parents and for children, it is mental health crises and burnout. And when a child burns out, I think, and we've experienced it in our house, if a child is in burnout, it is very difficult for the parents not to go down with them. No matter how robust you are as a human, as a parent, we have professional jobs, we have, I would say we're quite well-functioning adults. To watch your child break, 7 years old, 8 years old, or a teenager, whatever age, is the most distressing thing for you to helplessly watch and want to do the right thing, that's the impact, is that then you're in recovery for a really long time whilst trying to access support. And actually the supports that you're then trying are reactive, they're not proactive. And I think when support becomes proactive, then you can meet a child's needs and see their capacity and adapt before they hit crisis. But when that isn't happening, and when you're constantly facing barriers to support or being asked, what is it about your parenting that's causing them not to come into school on time, or not to, do the things that are expected of them. So in on an acute level, I think for individuals, parents and children, that's the impact. And I think on society as a whole, the impact then becomes, massive, strain on systems like the prison system, mental health services, social care, because children haven't had their needs met growing up. They then become adults that don't know how to kind of live independently or access services and advocate for themselves. So, yeah, I think there's huge ramifications on so many different levels.
And it goes beyond that as well, because you get the individual families who are in crisis, but they can't access support because they fall in that gap of it's neurodivergence, it's behaviour. And so what happens is, because things are escalating at home, parents are then calling paramedics, they might be calling the police, and children are being exposed to environments that actually make them a lot worse. A&E is not the appropriate environment for neurodivergent children. It's actually really distressing. Parents who are in crisis are calling police. And then you might get a police officer who understands and is amazing and can de-escalate the situation. But for many children who are already in panic, their fight flight mode has already been activated. A police officer in uniform turning up to the door will escalate that. And rather than them coming down, they go up. And then we see that, the older teenagers, they will end up in custody. And then they're being dealt with in an environment where they shouldn't be. And we know that their brains are not working, they're not cognitively thinking. So then the worry is, are they taking consequences or accepting questions that are being asked to them? Are they giving responses that are more of I just need this to stop, so I'm going to agree to everything you're saying, rather than...
What you're actually saying here is we've got the police, who we might have a good police officer, but they're not fully trained to know how
Yeah.
to deal with someone with neurodiversity. The hospital, again, might not be trained. And then again, other services that are providing you with assistance, they don't really understand that we're not all in the same box. We've all got different needs. We all react in different ways, and kind of fitting someone in the same box or telling a parent that they need to do this because that fits with social norms doesn't really work, and makes a problem even worse. Would you agree?
Yeah, 100%.
And then you've got the issue that where parents suspect that there's neurodivergence, there's such a wait to get diagnosed. And there's so much gatekeeping. I think if you were to refer your child today for an assessment and the GP agreed that thresholds were met for an assessment, you'd still be waiting over a year and a half, maybe 2 years, to even do the screening tool, let alone to get the actual assessment. Which is why
is there such a long wait?
There's just not enough money and there's not enough services.
And I also think there's been it's always, Joe and I have been social workers for, over 20 years. And I think actually that's always been the case. There's always been a backlog of neurodivergence assessments. So that in itself isn't new, but the problem has definitely got worse with more parents approaching and seeking referrals for assessments. And then I think we fall into a stigma towards families who do seek private services in order to access the right support, because when you're in that period of waiting for an assessment and your child is in crisis, what often families see is, you go into a meeting and the conversation is about the wrong thing. Like, we've sat in meetings where a teacher or, even say an educational psychologist will be trying to debate or trying to assess in that moment, is this child neurodivergent? Is this child autistic? As a parent, you know full well that your child is, and, you are the expert in that room, and you're feeling then completely undermined. And I've seen that so many times. And when my daughter was in crisis, she wasn't diagnosed at that point, and we were asking for referrals, and it was like, oh well, maybe because you work in the evenings and it's a big transition, when your child moves to junior school, and maybe she's finding it harder, she needs a bit more, it was very subtle parent blaming. And I was,
They blamed you, Louise.
yeah, and it was like, we need to get her diagnosed, because if we don't do that, then we're not going to get the support we need. So, we're not a rich family, we're not a wealthy family, but I knew enough because of my profession that waiting 3 years for an assessment was not an option, because she was in such crisis. So we had to borrow money and do what we needed to do to get those assessments done quickly. And once we did that, the conversation changed, because you're no longer trying to convince anybody that she's neurodivergent.
It's
Um,
interesting though, Louise, because you say you've hit the nail on the head, that not everyone's got a pot of money that they
Mhm.
can just go into,
No,
and you're having
no,
to spend money to convince professionals that actually, yes, I'm right. Please don't
yeah,
blame me anymore. It's not about my working pattern. It's not about the home life. I had
yeah,
a court case a while back, and we were criticised for wanting to go for a private assessment.
yeah,
And the court said, well, let's just get the local authority to assess whether you need to go for an
yeah,
assessment. Yeah, you say the waiting times for that was ridiculous. But a parent knows when something's not right.
Yeah, no, we
yeah,
hear a lot of that. There's a lot of if because quite a lot of parents of neurodivergent children, diagnosed or not, are likely neurodivergent themselves. It's something that we've come to realize in ourselves
yeah,
over time. And when we get passionate about something, and when we see that something's wrong, we deep dive into it. So you'll find that parents, once they've reached the point that, like we have, where you've done research and research and research, you're saying this is what's happening. Some of those parents in meetings are getting accused of medicalizing their children. You're because of the terms that they're using, and that it's almost like, well, you're looking for evidence of that, rather than the professionals around the table listening to the parent as an expert in their child,
mm,
an expert in their home environment, and looking at the evidence that these things exist. And I think part of that is the conflict between what is seen at school and what is seen at home.
How close to breaking are these families when they come to you then? From your experience, you deal with them on a day-to-day basis. How bad is it when these parents come to you and say, look, I need help. I've been through the system doesn't work. I need real help to kind of move forward.
I mean, it really varies at what
definitely.
stage people have found our service. Certainly, when we worked in the frontline social work, people are coming to you in crisis because they've been trying to get support and it hasn't been put in place. In Family Avenues, what we find is that once somebody's used our service, they then tell the rest of the same community about it, and it becomes more of something that's kind of sought out, not at breaking point, but more when they're realizing that something's going wrong and they want to make sense of it and work out how they move forward and what conversations they need to be having with school.
Mm.
So it really varies. There are not enough services out there. There's not enough to support all the neurodivergent families. There's not enough information out there.
There are resources out there, but I think a lot of people just need someone to sit down with you on a one-to-one and talk about your individual child.
Mm.
Um, because as everyone says, if you meet one autistic person, you meet one autistic person, and what works for one doesn't necessarily work for the other. And we see that in our own children that, are being brought up in the same house with the same parents. They've got very different needs and need very different responses. And I think, yeah, I think for us, a lot of the time when parents come to us, it's at that point fairly early on, not necessarily in crisis, although sometimes definitely is in crisis, but where they just go, well, now what do I do? Like, because, this doesn't help us navigate, the fact that my child won't eat, or the fact that my child, can't go to sleep, or, so it's kind of then sitting down and looking at their individual situation. And so, yeah, I think for us, it's, as Joe said, it's kind of people coming to us at very different
Mm.
points, depending on when they find us, really.
When you have like the assessment done, and when you're talking to schools, or CAMS or any other organisation, they are looking at that one individual child, and you might, like me, have three, or even,
Yes.
having just two children, the impact that they have on each other. I can give you examples. Like, I have one child who needs to vocally stim and also move constantly, and that will trigger his sister, who needs quiet and calm. And when you've got those dynamics going on, or that when one child's in crisis,
Mm,
the other one is then struggling because they're panicking about what's happening in the home,
mm,
it's hard to get a balance of where, if I was to go and speak to my younger son's primary school, all they would focus on is my younger son.
yeah.
Whereas I've got three children, one of them's nearly 15. You have to consider the household, the whole ecosystem that's going on there, and the
Yeah.
stress and strain, and also the parents who are often on the verge of burnout, or know that they need a break but just can't take one because
Yeah.
Yeah.
if they stop, the whole thing falls apart.
Going back to the blame game as basically what it is. I think the whole point of this podcast is to shine a light. There's a light at the end of the tunnel, that for real stories, real families, that we can talk about all the negatives, but actually there's a way out of it all. And I think it'd be great if you could address that. I think parents would love to know and just hear it, that they're not to blame for any of this, that the schools may kind of, like you said, blame working patterns and family life. The police might kind of blame the child and say bad behavior. But from your own view, who is to blame? Is there anyone to blame, or is it just the way we are with it, the situation?
I don't think anyone is specifically to blame. I think society has changed so much, and our education system and the way that we are taught to parent hasn't changed. I don't think anybody specifically is to blame. I think things have moved on. We've had an explosion of social media. We've got pressures in schools where schools are expected to teach SATs and be under test, and teachers are told what to teach and how to teach it. Classroom sizes are bigger than they've ever been. And parents, both, we're in a society where both parents work, and without that, there is not enough income to keep a house afloat, your home afloat. So all these pressures all build into this pressure cooker.
Mm,
And then on top of that, we find that the parenting advice that is often given is ineffective because it doesn't take into account the neurodivergence of the child or of the parent that's
yeah,
giving
the
that
wider
advice.
family. Yeah.
The traditional parenting of reward charts and timeouts and naughty steps does not work. It certainly doesn't work for neurodivergent children. And when parents are being told, well, you need to go on a parenting course, or I've just found another parenting course for you to do, you just need to be firmer, it's really unhelpful. And we speak to those families and say, you are not alone. If you are feeling alone, look at National Autistic Society website, look at
Young minds.
Young Minds, Papyrus.
Yeah.
There's lots of services out there. There will be support groups local to you. There's lots of really amazing charities that are doing fantastic work. Parent groups. You put one SEN parent in with another group of SEN parents, and you suddenly feel seen.
Yeah.
And I think I've been so lucky that I work with Lou and Paula, and that they have seen me through the whole of this process, from when my son was 5 and we first started struggling to now he's nearly 15. But you will never have a more fierce supporter than another SEN parent who
Yeah.
understands it.
So for any parents listening out there who have got SEN children, would you recommend just don't isolate yourself, talk to other parents who are in your position, Google, find groups around you?
Yeah, and there's groups,
100%.
there's groups online. I mean, not everybody wants to go, especially for neurodivergent adults. Going and sitting in a room with strangers can feel really scary.
Yeah.
But there are support groups out there that are online. There are support groups where you don't need to turn your camera on. There are support groups where you can sit in and not have your camera on and not speak.
I think once you do find that community, it just changes everything. Like, I know without Joe and Paula, I would not have got through the last several years. Absolutely not. And I'm, as I said, like, we're all professionals, but we've kind of guided each other and supported and validated each other. And it was Paula and Joe saying to me, like, stop it. Like, don't ever take her to school when she's dysregulated, because ultimately, as we know, that does not teach her any skills to cope with the environment that she was trying to avoid. She was in stress response. And I think just having people that have lived it already, that have been going through it a bit longer than you, to be able to give you that validation and go, it's okay to say, like, she's not able to access school at the moment. So once we've got some things in place to help her do that and she feels able, then we can start making some, improvements to her attendance.
Yeah, it's having the confidence, though, isn't it, to be able to stand your ground and say
Yeah.
to these professionals,
Yeah.
no, she's not coming in, he's not coming in today. I know what's best. I know the situation. And like you've said, you'll have many professionals just say, go on, it's fine, bring them to school, let them do this. But the stress that's causing to these children when they're in this situation, it
Yeah.
outweighs the benefit of coming to school, in essence, doesn't it, really?
Well, because it teaches that child that the people who are meant to keep you safe are going to force you into a situation where you feel unsafe.
Yeah.
And that's really dangerous. If your parents are knowingly putting you in a scenario where you feel like you're in danger, because that's what the
That's how
fight
it
flight
feels.
response is.
Mm.
That's their kind of your body's warning system that this is an unsafe environment.
Mm.
It's then encouraging masking, which is really dangerous, and fawning, which again, we're teaching them not to be their true selves, and we're not teaching them coping strategies. We're not teaching them to listen or recognize what their body's telling them.
For anyone who's listening, Joe, what is masking?
So masking is where you pretend everything's fine and that you're coping. And so for children who are autistic, some can really struggle with things like eye contact. So because they know that they're meant to make eye contact, they will force themselves to make eye contact. And for some autistic individuals, that's actually quite painful and uncomfortable.
Going back to what Joe said about masking, that it can be painful. Are we talking literally physical pain for, say, if they're stimming, or if they do have I want to use the word meltdown in relation to what's kind of stimulating them or dysregulating them? Can it actually be physical pain to these
Yeah.
children?
Particularly if they are in distress. So if their nervous system is in fight flight mode or on the verge of fight flight mode, then things feel very different. So, for example, I could do this to Louise normally and she's fine, but if she's in a meltdown, that could
Yeah,
feel
gonna
like
be
I've assaulted her.
So
Yeah.
just for those who are listening rather than watching. So
Oh, sorry.
no, it's okay.
Feel her hand
The
on my
wonders of
shoulder.
technology here, Joe. But literally touching Louise
Yeah.
on the arm,
Yeah.
that could cause physical pain. Then
Yeah.
And I think when we think about sensory needs, and I think sometimes, people really struggle to understand that capacity fluctuates.
Yeah.
So, a child may be able to tolerate the label in the back of their school jumper every single day, but then one day they absolutely cannot, and that label is causing them physical pain, and they can't possibly focus on anything else whatsoever because that label is so significantly painful to them. And it's because overall their capacity is reduced because of the exhaustion that they feel from constantly masking. It just takes so much from them that ultimately then their capacity to cope with, sensory input or, noises can then feel physically painful to a child that normally they might not notice.
And they do notice things that neurotypical people don't.
They are
Like we
more
get
sensitive anyway.
children who can hear electricity running.
Yeah.
You get. I remember going to a talk about by somebody who used to offer like sensory advice to classrooms, and he was talking about he's an ADHD adult, and he said, I walk in the room and I can tell them what the problem is straight away, because I'm like, I can hear that fan, that air conditioning unit, and you've got him sat
Wow.
right under it. That's the problem. Um, and even like my youngest hates socks. And this morning, again, we had a conversation about why do they put the soft bit of the sock on the outside and not on the inside?
Yeah, it's completely illogical. Yeah.
You don't really think about it, do you? And especially that's so surprising to hear that people with, say, some people with neurodiversity are so sensitive to noises that they can hear
Yeah.
that, say, the humming of electricity, or say the fan not working. So that's surprising.
We've got my daughter who she needs quiet, she needs calm. And then I've got a child who needs noise. That his
Mm.
noises are self-regulation. He does vocal stims that, and I mean, he does every kind of stim. And it just makes me think, because you said earlier, is stimming painful? Stimming in itself is not painful when children are allowed to do it to self-regulate. Where they are not allowed or don't feel safe to self-regulate, then the stimming can become self-injurious. So you might find that they're
Yes.
picking their fingers until they bleed because they
Yeah.
can't flick their hands. Or they might be picking at nails until they've all gone. Or they might be chewing the inside of the lip.
Skin picking, hair pulling.
Yeah.
There's so many ways that children will subtly sensory seek in a way that is actually harmful.
Yeah.
What's concerning from this conversation is that we talk about all this, and there's the physical, like you said, can actually cause physical pain, or not being able to stim can cause issues to a child's, say, self-harm in essence.
Yeah.
Um,
Mhm.
when we get to family court and we've got parents who are separating, if there is a child involved and you've got one parent who doesn't really accept the diagnosis of neurodiversity, the courts, from my perspective, they're not that well averse to dealing with children with neurodiversity, because they see it as a rare kind of thing, but it isn't in any shape or form.
No.
Have you had any experience with the family courts at all with neurodiverse children?
We've had loads of experience of family law, both private and public law, with neurodivergent children. And I think what is so often misunderstood is, when we talk about parent blame, what we will often hear is, the parent that the child lives with most of the time, and the parent that has to get them to school and do all those, daily demands that are necessary. If that is the parent that is saying, you know, our child is neurodivergent, we need to parent them in this way, they've done all the courses, they've done all the learning, they've put all the research in place in order to parent their child in the way that is absolutely necessary for their well-being. But then you might have the other parent that says, well, they don't behave like that in my house,
Mm.
and we don't do that in our house. At our house they do sit at the table when they do finish their dinner, or at our house they do have to come out and do X, whatever it is. And then I think the child is then expected to adapt, not only in terms of going to school, but simply spending the weekend with their other parent. And if as co-parents you are in the family court in private law, you're not probably co-parenting from a collaborative perspective, because if you were, you wouldn't be in a court, because you wouldn't need to be. So I think that is what needs to be understood, is that because a child might be behaving better for one parent doesn't mean that that parent's parenting is more effective than the parent where they're struggling.
It's a miracle, though, isn't it, Louise, that you say you have one parent who said, I can get the child to do this, and this whilst they're in my care. You think you absolutely can't,
Well,
because
sometimes they can, but it's actually because the child's nervous system tells them that this parent isn't going to respond to me appropriately if I don't do what's expected of me. So there comes back in the masking and the fawning and having, to survive a situation, because they know their needs aren't going to be met if they don't. So then they go home, say on a Sunday evening, to the parent where they are safe, and it all comes out and it all explodes. And I think, that's not new. That's something that's been, very well talked about for a very long time. But I think the awareness that we have now for neurodivergence, it's really important for not just courts, but anybody that contributes to decisions that are made about a child's day-to-day living arrangements in a court environment. So, social workers, CAFCAS social workers, anyone that, child psychiatrists and psychologists that are doing the assessments that contribute to those decisions, they need to have expertise in recognising neurodivergence and how important it is for parents to be consistent in how they meet their needs. Because I think to kind of use a child's behaviour as a reason to say that one parent's doing it right and another parent's doing it wrong is so wrong and so inaccurate that it is the long-term harm that is then done to children because the wrong decisions are being made for their future and for their care is, it's devastating to see, and we see it all the time.
And the other thing that I think is really important is that we take on board how children communicate. Like when I've taken my children to appointments with professionals, even as 8-9-year-olds, they would sit and expect them to answer questions in like an interview style, making eye contact, talking to them. When they're not giving that, they are assumed to be disengaged, not listening. And it's not understanding you're dealing with a child. Let's use a different form of communication. Let's use drawing. Let's use writing. Let's use pictures. Don't just rely on a verbal response from somebody, particularly for neurodivergent children who may find it really difficult to put into words what they need to tell you.
It's also, I think, thinking about the environment that you're talking to the child in. So it's not always, it is about how you communicate. Of course, that's, the most important thing, but the environment that they're in. And I know, for example, when my daughter was having her assessment for her EHCP, the educational psychologist, when she was doing her report, it was actually the school that said, don't talk to her whilst she's in school. Because if you talk to her in school, she's going to tell you that everything's absolutely fine. And I think the same goes for talking to a child about, their living arrangements or, their family time arrangements with the other parent.
For those who are listening, Louise, what is an EHCP?
So an education and healthcare plan is so every child that has special educational needs, there is a certain budget that schools have in order to support them and meet their needs. If the child needs a level of provision that they need to meet those needs requires more than is available in that budget, or a completely different type of provision, a different setting, then you need EHCP in order to get the funding. But also, the whole purpose of an EHCP is to identify the individual needs of an individual child. It's not generic, whereas a lot of, provisions that are in place to support special educational needs in general, we'll try this and we've got this provision and we'll try that. And then you wonder why it's not working. Whereas when you've got an educational psychologist that has done an expert assessment on a child, a speech and language assessment, an occupational therapy assessment, and, if the right people have contributed to that, then, the child's needs, somebody should be able to look at a child's education healthcare plan and come away and think, I know that child really well and I know what support they need and how to provide it.
What's the process like?
So the process, it's obviously, we know there's the white paper that's come out and the process is going to change, unfortunately. But as it stands at the moment, either the parent or the child can apply for an EHCP to the local authority directly, and you provide evidence of need. The threshold is very low for an EHC needs assessment. So it is just simply that the child may have special educational needs and they may need additional provision in order to meet those needs. That isn't always applied when the decisions are made to undertake an assessment. So the local authority will read the application and then I think they've got 6 weeks to make a decision as to whether or not they're going to assess for an EHCP. So if you get past that hurdle, then they have 20 weeks. Actually, I think it's 20 weeks from the date of the application, but overall they get 20 weeks to undertake the assessment. Sometimes that is done within that timescale, sometimes it's not. Most of the time, the local authority will independently decide who is going to contribute to that assessment. So it has to be an educational psychologist. So there'll always be an educational psychologist assessment. But as parents, especially if your child is neurodivergent, it's so important that it includes speech and language and occupational therapy, because you're not going to get a holistic understanding of a child without that input. And I think, to secure that, if I just, kind of reference our own journey, we went through 2 years of making sure that occupational therapy was in my child's EHCP, and we paid privately for that assessment to be done. And, very reluctantly, we pushed and we went to mediation and we submitted appeals in order to get to the point of just having the local authority agree that she needed an occupational therapy assessment. So once all of those assessments are done, then the local authority will decide whether to issue an EHCP. So that is a point at which they may say no, and then you have to go to appeal, and that can take a year to get to the tribunal.
Would you say it's an easy process? Because it does not sound like an easy process to
No,
me in any
it's not
shape
an
or
easy
form.
process. I think it's an appalling, I think the law as it currently stands is effective. It should be effective if it was being followed. It is on the side of children. And, if local authorities were compliant with it, then it's a good process and it should be successful. I think
Why aren't they following it then, Louise? What's the problem? Why is the local authority not following what the law's in place?
I think demand has increased so significantly. So EHCPs were introduced in 2014. And since that time, as it's no secret, there's been an absolute, like a massive influx of people understanding neurodivergence and understanding that that's why children are struggling in school and that they're needing such a high level of provision in order to be able to access and the education that they deserve. And I don't think, I know local authorities struggle to one, understand that, but two, to fund it. So then we see the gatekeeping. And I think if a local authority, I remember speaking to a parent once that said, their child had been out of school for like 3 years. From the time of applying for an EHC needs assessment to getting an EHCP that accurately reflected their needs and the correct school placement to meet those needs, had been 3 years. And they went to the local government ombudsman to ask them to investigate whether or not the local authority had complied with its duties. And the ombudsman said that they did their assessment and they said, no, the local authority have not. And as a result, this child has missed years of their education. I think the local authority ended up having to compensate the family. Say they compensated them £5,000, and it wasn't that much money, but say they compensated them £5,000, they have saved much, much more than.
Oh, yeah. But what's compensation going to do, Louise? It's not going to bring it back at all, is it?
No, exactly. That the child is too often missed in decisions that are being made. And I think and there's no accountability. That ultimately is what it comes down to. And I think we've got some really good MPs at the moment that are, kind of really trying to improve and hold a spotlight over local authorities that are not adhering to legislation and, the impact that is having on individual children and families.
You've been through the process, and both of you. What's the practical tips you would give a parent who's got a child with neurodiversity who are going through the EHCP process?
I would say we're both professionals and we've both found it incredibly stressful and the most frustrating experience that I have ever been through, genuinely. And I do think if I've found it that hard, if I found it that it's broken me at points. It absolutely has. And I think if it's been that hard for me as a professional who has a higher level of understanding of these processes and systems and children's needs, how on earth are other families supposed to navigate this? And I think absolutely access your local SEND-IAS system, which you're going to ask me what that stands for. But every local
I am.
authority,
You've read my mind.
every local authority has a offer of an advocacy service that parents can access. So, if a decision is made, I think it's so easy. If a parent doesn't know the process and they're not accessing the right support or the right advice. For example, I have spoken to parents that go, oh, we applied for an or my child's school applied for an EHCP, but the local authority said they didn't need one. So that's good. Like, they don't need one. And it was like, oh my goodness, like you absolutely have got to access advice from experts within the field. We don't offer advocacy at Family Avenues. That's not to say that we won't in the future. We definitely offer guidance and, support, and we give parents tools to take with them into meetings and things like that. But there are some absolutely amazing advocates out there.
There are template letters.
There's templates on IPSY.
They've got all the templates. I think the biggest thing that I would say is if you've had a response from the local authority that says your child doesn't meet the threshold for an assessment, appeal it. The vast majority of appeals go through because, like Louise said, the actual threshold is low. It's just not being followed. I went through the appeal process with my eldest, and I remember the judge, because it was a paper trial, but the judge on his paperwork said, I don't understand how you can possibly say he doesn't meet threshold for an assessment with all the needs that are presenting and you have not assessed. He meets the threshold for an assessment, not necessarily for services, but he meets the threshold for assessment. So appeal it, and look to websites like, is it Send SOS?
Yeah. IPSY.
Yeah, there'll be template letters out there that you can use, because the system's definitely biased. If you're educated, if you're vocal, if you've got access to the internet, you're more likely to be heard. You're more likely to stand up. So I think there are definitely discrepancies in society whereby the people who are less able to be vocal, the less able to challenge, will be missing out. It'll be hitting harder.
Why are we even getting to that point? They know it's a wrong decision, and they're pushing a lot. And like you said, Joe, if you've got a computer, you've got education, you're able to kind of have that advantage. You shouldn't be able to have that advantage, and it's wrong that you do. But then you get to the next barrier where the local authority are going, well, you're absolutely right, but we're going to stamp it no anyway, because we're going to try a look to see whether you just give up at this hurdle and don't appeal it and don't do this. That shouldn't be the system we're living in. That should be, everyone should be working together to help these children. That sounds absurd that they are doing that.
Yeah. And it's these touch points, it's these bits where parents are looking for support, touching with school and saying, I need help, touching with the local authority and saying, we need an EHCP. When those go unheard and unresponded to, that's when we're getting parents in crisis, because they just don't know where to go. And then it'll carry on and drift without the child getting their needs met, a parent hanging on, by the skin of their teeth, and then things fall apart. There is hope, though. I don't want to be, there is hope.
No, you're right.
There's,
and this is why you're on, Joe. You're the light at the end of the tunnel. You show that these parents, as long as you stand your ground, you can get somewhere. But it's having that honest conversation that the system is nowhere perfect in any shape or form.
But it does worry me. It worries me about people who have English as a second language, who don't have access. There are families out there who don't have access to the internet at home. I could imagine trying to go to your local library and log on and research about your crisis at home when you've got multiple children with multiple needs and you're a single parent. Like, it's not going to happen. But that's where your local SEND networks come in, because you will never meet a more fierce parent than a SEND parent.
If you've got a parent listening now and they're in a time of crisis or at the early stages and they don't know what to do, and for the child with SEN, what would you say to them to try and get them through? What would be the first thing they need to do? bearing in mind you've got the experience, you've been there, what would you tell them to try and get the help?
That they're not on their own, that they're not to blame, that if things are going wrong at home, it's because there's
Unmet
stresses,
needs.
there's unmet needs. They can document that behavior that they're seeing at home. Is there a specific time? Is there a specific place? Is there a specific incident that's happening? To try, and then you can use that to try and look back for clues, because the child won't know. They won't know why they're having an explosion. And often because of masking, nobody else knows. The other really important thing is keep all your emails, any email you send to school, any conversation you have with schools or with the local authority or with anybody else, follow it up with an email so that you've got an email trail in terms of you've noted that there's a problem, you're asking for support, and find your local SEND network. Use Facebook, speak to other parents on the school playgrounds. You'll recognise the other parents with their children because you recognise the struggles.
We're coming to an end now. Can I just say a massive thank you to Joanne and Louise from Family Avenue. I say this, I've said this on the first episode, it's your time to plug. So where can people find you and get your support? Because what you do is absolutely amazing.
So we're on all the socials. So we're on LinkedIn, we're on Facebook, and we're on Instagram under Family Avenue.
What's your tag again? Sorry, is it Family Avenues your tag?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, at Family Avenues. Yeah.
I sound hip by calling it tag, but no, I'll take that. But kind of say again, massive thank you for coming on. It's been really interesting to hear from you and to hear the practical tips. And again, we've talked about the negative, we talked about the systems not working, but you two are just literally the epitome that it may not work, but you'll get there in the end. As long as you stand your ground, you know your rights, and you are fierce. And both of you are literally the fiercest people that I know. So I want to say massive thank you for coming on.
Thank you. Can we just quickly plug our website as well? So
Of course you can.
Yeah.
So the website is www.familyavenues.co.uk, and there's a ton of resources on there. So there's our paid for services, which the bespoke family directions call, which is probably the most valuable of the services on there for our families.
Yeah.
But there's also information for professionals on there. So I think you've had a little look at the
I have, and it's very, very good. You have
and
my endorsement.
Hopefully it's something that's going to be useful, in terms of just helping to kind of spread the knowledge of neurodivergence and kind of what problem is if it goes wrong and what to do to make sure it goes right. But there's resources like that for social workers. There's resources like that for home visits. There's all sorts on there. So do go onto the website and have a look. And if professionals ever want to kind of link in with us, they can reach out, and we can, we want to try and change systems as well as supporting individual families. So we'll always try and find time to answer questions.
Yeah, always.
Brilliant. Thank you again. Thank you for the work that you do. And it's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having us on.
If there's one thing to take away from this episode, it's that not every child fits a system, and not every family gets the support they need when they need it. Understanding changes everything. I want to say a massive thank you to Joanne Parry and Louise Legge from Family Avenues for joining me today and sharing the reality behind what families are living through when trying to get support for children with neurodiversity. As always, I'm Richard Port, and this is Let's Talk About Family Law. Thank you for joining me, and if this conversation resonated with you or with someone you know, please share it, start the conversation, and help more people feel understood. So, let's talk about it.
And let's talk. I've got something for you and you've got something for me. A simple little back and forth, nothing to it, you see. Life could be a beach with a cool breeze by the sea if we just set ourselves free. So let's talk. I've got something for you and you've got something for me. A simple little back and forth, nothing to it, you see. Life could be a beach with a cool breeze by the sea if we just set ourselves free. So let's talk. So yeah, just to be clear, I'm not advocating sort of creepy harassment or something, or just being jolly all the time. That's actually appalling in my mind. Just basic human interaction, Hello, how are you? Lovely. Okay, bye.